Welcome to the chosen few. Everyone knows the story of Dunkirk. 330,000 men snatched from the jaws of death. A miracle of deliverance. But 150 miles away, another story was being written in blood. A story history almost forgot. While the world celebrated the return of the British Army, 10,000 men of the 51st Highland Division were still fighting. Left behind, isolated, and surrounded by the full might of Erwin Rommel's panzers. They were the shield that allowed the miracle to happen. But who was there to save them? Today, we follow the 51st from the forests of the Saar to the cliffs of St. Valéry. And I want you to join them. Right now, pick a number between 1 and 100. Hold it in your mind. By the end of this story, that number will determine your fate. Whether you escaped on the last boat, fell in the streets of France, or began a 5-year nightmare in a German prison camp. This is the story of the other BEF. The men who stood their ground when the world was falling apart. This is the tragedy of the 51st Highlanders. While the history books often paint the evacuation of Dunkirk as the final chapter of the British Expeditionary Force in 1940, for 10,000 men, it was only the beginning of a nightmare. These were the men of the 51st Highland Division, the Highlands' finest. They weren't just soldiers, they were the living embodiment of a martial tradition that stretched back centuries. The Black Watch, the Seaforths, the Gordons, the Camerons, and the Argylls. These were men from the remote glens of the north, the windswept islands, and the industrial heartlands of the Clyde. Led by the stoic and deeply respected Major General Victor Fortune, they arrived in France not as a defeated force, but as an elite unit ready to prove their worth. But as the main body of the British Army gathered in the north for a desperate escape, the 51st was nowhere near the beaches. In a decision that would haunt the British High Command for decades, the division had been detached and sent 400 miles south. Their mission was to serve under French command on the infamous Maginot Line, occupying a sector known as the Saar. To the French, the presence of the kilted Highlanders was a vital morale booster. To the British commanders, it was a way to blood the troops in a quiet sector. The atmosphere in early May 1940 was a surreal mix of boredom and building dread. In the Saar region, the Highlanders occupied the Ligne de Contact, a series of forward outposts in front of the massive French fortresses. This was the phony war. During the day, they improved their trenches. At night, Scottish patrols slipped into the no-man's land of the thick German woods, engaging in silent, deadly skirmishes with the enemy. The pipes often echoed through the valleys at dusk, a haunting, defiant sound that the Germans began to recognize with a mix of curiosity and fear. Everything changed on May 10th. The phony war didn't just end, it ignited. The German war machine launched Fall Gelb, Case Yellow, a lightning strike of such speed and ferocity that the world stood paralyzed. While the world's attention was fixed on the invasion of Belgium and the Netherlands, the 51st found themselves facing a relentless tide of steel in the dense woods of the Saar. The sickle cut, the German breakthrough at Sedan, was the masterstroke. As the panzers raced toward the English Channel, they physically severed the 51st from the rest of the British Army. The realization was slow and agonizing. As news trickled down that the main British force was retreating toward the coast, General Fortune waited for orders to join them. But those orders never came. Instead, the French High Command, desperate to maintain a front line at any cost, ordered the 51st to abandon their hard-won positions in the Saar and move deeper into the chaos of central France. They were being used to plug a gap that was already miles wide. The march was a descent into a Gothic nightmare. The Highlanders moved through a landscape that was rapidly disintegrating. Dust-choked roads were clogged with hundreds of thousands of panicked refugees. Families pushing prams, old men on hay wains, and retreating French soldiers who had thrown away their rifles. Above this chaos, the Luftwaffe's Stukas shrieked like prehistoric birds, diving to turn the columns into graveyards of twisted metal and dead horses. Yet, through the smoke and the screams, the Highlanders marched in step. Occasionally, a piper would strike up a tune, a defiant, ancient sound that momentarily stilled the panic around them. They were heading for the Somme River, a place where their fathers had bled 24 years earlier, to hold a line that existed only on the maps of generals who had already lost the war. By the time the last boat left the shores of Dunkirk on June 4th, the world believed the British Army was safe. But for the 51st, the real battle was just beginning. On June 5, 1940, the sun rose over a landscape that was about to be pulverized. The German onslaught, codenamed Fall Rot Case Red, began with a roar of artillery that stretched from the Somme to the sea. The 51st Highland Division now found themselves in an impossible position. They were holding a massive 18-mile front, a distance that would normally require 3 full divisions to defend. They weren't just fighting for ground. They were fighting for the very survival of the Allied cause in France. As the French units to their left and right began to buckle and dissolve, the Highlanders became a lonely island of khaki in a sea of retreating grey. The enemy facing them was the rising star of the German military, Erwin Rommel. His 7th Panzer Division moved with such terrifying, unpredictable speed that they were nicknamed the Ghost Division. Rommel didn't play by the rules of the Great War. He didn't bother with traditional front lines. He simply drove around the Highlanders' strongpoints, cutting their phone lines, capturing their supply depots, and appearing miles behind their positions before they even knew he had moved. By June 6th, the 51st was no longer part of a coordinated defense. They were a rearguard, fighting a desperate battle of survival while marching backwards. The heat of that June was stifling, a cruel contrast to the violence. The Highlanders marched by night to avoid the predatory eyes of the Luftwaffe, covering 20 to 30 miles at a time on feet that were a mass of blisters. By day, they turned to fight. At places like the Abbeville bridgehead, the Scottish infantry proved they were still the lads from hell. Men of the Black Watch and the Seaforths launched bayonet charges against German armoured cars, a scene of 18th century courage clashing with 20th century steel. They fought for every hedge, every farmhouse, and every bridge, often holding positions until they were completely surrounded before breaking out in the dark. They were exhausted, low on ammunition, and sustained only by grit and a grim Highland stubbornness. But as they retreated, the political reality was becoming as dangerous as the German tanks. General Fortune was receiving conflicting orders. His British instincts told him to retreat to the major port of Le Havre, where the Royal Navy could perform a massive evacuation. But the French command, terrified that the British were abandoning them again after Dunkirk, insisted the 51st swing north toward the tiny fishing port of St. Valéry-en-Caux. It was a fatal directive. St. Valéry was a picturesque town nestled in a deep valley, flanked by 300-foot chalk cliffs. It was never designed to be a fortress. Every step toward St. Valéry brought the Highlanders closer to a geographical trap. As they moved, Rommel's panzers were racing them to the coast, moving along parallel roads, often just a few miles away. The Highlanders could see the dust clouds of the German columns on the horizon, a constant reminder that the trap was closing. By June 10th, the fighting 51st finally reached the outskirts of the town. They were the last British soldiers left on French soil. Behind them lay the cold, grey waters of the English Channel. In front of them, the combined weight of 2 German army corps. The men could smell the salt air, a scent that usually promised the safety of home. But here, it only signaled the end of the road. As a cold rain began to fall, mixing with the oily smoke of burning trucks and discarded equipment, the Highlanders began to dig into the hard, chalky soil. They were tired, they were hungry, and they were alone. But as they fixed their bayonets and checked their dwindling pouches of ammunition, they prepared to give Erwin Rommel the fight of his life. The morning of June 11th, 1940, revealed the full horror of the Highlanders' position. The 51st was packed into a cramped, 3-mile perimeter around the harbour of St. Valéry. To the soldiers in the trenches, the plan was simple. Hold the line until nightfall, then board the ships of the Royal Navy. But the geography they had been forced into was a death trap. The town sat in a hollow, and as the morning mist cleared, the Highlanders looked up and saw a sight that chilled their blood. Rommel's tanks hadn't just reached the outskirts. They had captured the towering cliffs overlooking the town. From those heights, German gunners looked directly down into the streets, the harbour, and even onto the decks of the few ships already in the port. The massacre began at point-blank range. British destroyers and civilian, little ships tried to approach the harbour under a hail of artillery fire, but they were met with a wall of steel from the cliffs. Then, the weather itself turned traitor. A thick, impenetrable sea fog rolled in from the Channel, blinding the Royal Navy. Out at sea, over 200 rescue vessels sat idle in the white void, unable to see the signal lights from the shore or the beaches where 10,000 men were waiting for a miracle. Inside the town, the fighting became a chaotic, house-to-house struggle. The Highlanders fought with the ferocity of men who knew there was no escape. In the narrow, cobblestone streets, Gordon Highlanders used Bren guns and anti-tank rifles to hold off panzers at every street corner. The V-shaped valley became a funnel of fire. But by the morning of June 12th, the situation shifted from desperate to hopeless. The 51st had run out of ammunition. Their heavy guns were silent, their trucks were burning, and the French forces in the southern sector of the town had already raised the white flag. General Fortune now faced the most agonizing choice of his life. He could order a final, suicidal charge that would result in the total annihilation of the division, or he could save the lives of his men for a future war. At 10:30 a.m., the order was given to cease fire. For the proud men of the 51st, the sudden silence was more painful than the shelling. Many soldiers wept openly as they smashed their rifle stocks against the stone walls or threw their beloved bagpipes into the sea to prevent them from becoming German trophies. When Fortune met Rommel to surrender, the Desert Fox was respectful, recognizing the incredible bravery of the men he had spent a week trying to break. But for the Highlanders, the humiliation was total. The miracle of Dunkirk was a victory of escape, but St. Valéry was a tragedy of isolation. The 51st had been the shield that allowed others to live, but for them, the war was now a 1,000-mile march into 5 long years of German captivity. They were marched across Europe, through the heart of the Third Reich, to brutal POW camps in Poland and Germany. They became the forgotten BF, their sacrifice overshadowed by the jubilant news from the Dunkirk beaches. But the story of the 51st didn't end in the barbed wire of the Stalags. Back in the Highlands of Scotland, the news of the surrender hit like a thunderclap. Every village and glen felt the loss. In response, a new 51st Division was raised from the brothers, sons, and cousins of the men lost at St. Valéry. They carried the memory of the 1940 Division like a holy relic. This new 51st would eventually lead the charge at El Alamein, chase Rommel across Africa, and, 4 years to the month after the surrender, they would storm the beaches of Normandy. They fought their way back to St. Valéry in September 1944, liberating the town and finally settling the score. But for the veterans of the old 51st, the ghosts of 1940 remained. They were the men who stood their ground when the world was falling apart, proving that even in the darkest defeat, the spirit of the Highlands, brave, stubborn, and fiercely loyal, could never truly be broken. Now let's see what happened to the number you picked earlier. If you picked any of the following numbers: 32, 52, 65, 82, 88, 98. Your journey ended in the fields of the Somme or the streets of St. Valéry. If your number comes up on the screen now, you were captured and remained in a POW camp for the remainder of the war if they were lucky. Unfortunately, the 3 numbers that remain on the screen died while on the brutal march to the camps or while working under terrible conditions as slaves for their German captors. So those of you who chose the following numbers, you made it back to Blighty. Well done. So as we do each episode, let's take a moment to remember those that gave so much. So thank you all for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. If you enjoyed the content, please like and subscribe for more.